In this video, we're going to take a look at the @request_param annotation and see how it interacts with forms with Spring Boot and TimeLeaf. We've seen request_param before. You might recall this add specimen endpoint. There's a latitude here, and you see it's 31 here. Notice that's the same number that we have down here. Now, if I change this, say, to 55 and hit enter, you notice that that number updates to 55 as well. So what I put up here in the URL in this name-value pair, as soon as I hit refresh, that value will be reflected down below. Let's remember how that works. First of all, we're in our controller class. And you see we have the add specimen endpoint with request method get. Now we have this request param, and we say we're specifically looking for latitude. Required is false, and if it's not present, we go with the default value of 0. So in other words, if I go ahead and take latitude off of here, if I take this entire unit, notice that 0 populates down below. Now, what about the required false? What if we made that required true? What happens then? And let's make one more change. Required true, let's go ahead and take off the default value and just leave it as required true, and we'll save. Let's go back to this page we were editing before, and you see that we have add specimen. I've taken off the latitude parameter we had before. I hit refresh, and notice it comes to an error page called bad request status 400. Well, it's not very verbose. That is indicating to us that a required attribute up here in the get URL is not available. When I put the attribute back in, no problem. Page renders just as it did before. Whoops. So I can put in something like 52, or we'll make that 57 and hit enter. And you see the page still renders. But as soon as I remove this, then we'll get that 400 error back again. Now, we could go ahead and put our default back in if we wanted. So I can just Control-Z that and save and restart. Refresh our page. And you see now, provided that we have a default value, we can go ahead and leave it off even if required is true. Now that does feel kind of redundant, so my preference would be only to use a default value if indeed the required is set to false. Okay, so let's think about how we can use this now. One thing that you'll see frequently on web-based applications is a common menu bar across the top with a universal search. So a simple one text field that's just searching for data. We don't have a whole bunch of radio buttons and options. It's just put your text in here and I'll search across all columns for that. I'd like to make something like that. So I navigate back here to start.html, which is essentially the template page that we're looking at that is drawing this. And as I say, this page is getting a little bit cumbersome, a little bit long-winded now, but don't worry, we will refactor it in a moment. Let's start with this very top where we have Welcome to Plant Places. And I'm going to wrap this in a form. So we'll use a form tag. And we'll say action equals pound. Just like I've done below on line number 14. We're just putting a different form here. Action equals pound. Okay. And then th:\action equals double quote, @ curly, / search plants. So that's our endpoint search plants. Just remember that's a capital P on that. And then we'll say method equals get, like so. And open and close form. So whatever we're submitting here, we need to wrap in these form tags. Now within that, I can say input type equals text. Name equals search term, capital T on search term. I just want to remember that. And looks like I misspelled name. So at the moment, I'm going to keep things fairly simple, and I'm not going to worry about wiring this up to a DTO as I've done in the example down below. I just want to have an area where I can collect some information from the user. Let's go ahead and add a button as well. So button name equals submit. Type equals submit. And then we'll say like so, and then we'll go ahead and say value equals 0, and then we'll just say search, like so, and we'll save. I restarted the application, I refreshed the page, and you see here's our search screen. I can say something like Eastern Redbud, and again, we don't want to define too greatly what the user can type in here. We want to be able to anticipate anything that a user might type. I hit search and I don't have an endpoint set up for the search plants yet. And so it gives me an error page, so we know where we need to go next. In our controller class, I will make a new endpoint. So I'll make a new method here and give us a little bit of room so we can see it a little bit better. And we will say public string search plants, like so. Open and close, and just like so. Let's run back to start and confirm, yeah, search plants is the endpoint that we need. So I'm simply going to put a request mapping up above. And say, okay, we want to come here if we get search plants, like so. And we'll say return start. We'll need to do more with this eventually, but we'll go ahead and start with what we have here so we can at least get this to compile. So I right-clicked to set a breakpoint, and I did go ahead, I paused the video for a moment, and I went ahead and just started in the debugger by right-clicking on Plant Places application and run in debugger, or debug as rather. So let's go ahead and go back to our add plant screen. Or we can just go to start, really, any screen will be fine. And sure enough, the page loads, and I will go ahead and type in Eastern Redbud. I could just use that autocomplete down below, and choose search, and now you'll see Eclipse lights up orange to indicate this breakpoint has been hit. But the trick is, we don't know what the user's search term is, do we? So I'll press F8 to tell it to continue, and what we want to do now is gather that search term. Let's start by using what we already know, which is this @request_param annotation that we put together in a previous video. So in this previous video, we were grabbing data directly off of the URL. In this case, we're getting the data from a form, but it's essentially coming across the same pipe. So we go down and we say, okay, we just enhance our method signature here to say, I want to hear from search term. Required equals false. Yeah, we'll go ahead and make that required equals false. And default value, we'll just make it, empty string for default value. Now that describes the argument we're going to pass into the method, but we still need a name for that argument that we're going to pass into the method. So you see here we have the request param annotation, and you see it gets kind of long-winded like you think that's it, but actually this annotation is simply describing this parameter that comes next. So we still need that parameter which comes next. So we go back down and we're going to say string search term. Just like so. So search term is essentially a variable. With that, we can now debug. So we'll say search term. We can do I'm just putting in a dummy line here that will allow us to debug a simple concatenation. So we'll say maybe enhanced string, enhanced term equals search term plus. Again, just a dummy line where I can snap in a debugger and take a look at it. So let me save, and we will restart in the debugger. The debugger is now running, and I'm also on my start screen, so I'm going to go ahead and type in Eastern Redbud and hit search. Just a moment, our breakpoint should hit, and sure enough, here we go. So with the breakpoint set, I can mouse over and look at the value, or I can simply go over to the Variables tab to the right. But you see as I mouse over, sure enough, it says Eastern Redbud. So without the complexity of a Java object, we're able to grab some form data. Now, what if we don't know which field we want to grab? Because in our case here, in our controller, we know that we're looking for a field called search term. But what if we don't know what's out there and we just kind of want to take a look at all of them? We can use another permutation of this request param annotation to capture that scenario as well. First, let me go ahead and choose F8 to release the debugger. Let that go. Now, I kind of want to keep what I have up here because I have a feeling I'm going to use this again. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this method. We know that copy-paste is bad, of course. But I'm just going to change the endpoint a little bit so I can look at another way to do this. So I'll tell you what. We will call this one search plants map, or let's say search plants all. And I'm going to call this one, we'll just call that search plants 1 for a moment. I'm keeping both of these in because I have a hunch I'm going to want to roll back to this one at some point, and I have not yet committed and pushed to version control, which I should. And I will do after this video is over. Let me go ahead and take this @request param annotation And I'm going to take off all of the extra stuff, including this string search term. We're just going to use the @requestParam annotation, and then I'm going to say map, and then we're going to say string, comma string, and we'll say request params. Okay, now over here we no longer have a search term, so we'll get rid of this line, and we'll simply say request params, do something like size, int params equals request param size. And again, this is just to give me a place where I can snap a breakpoint so we can look at this in the debugger. So because I changed this endpoint name, this guy's not going to get called yet. This guy is the one that's going to get called, the one called search plants all. So I'll save, terminate the current debug session, and restart again in the debugger. The debugger's restarted. Let's say Paul this time, and I'm going to hit search, and Eclipse lights up orange, indicating the debugger has engaged. And let's take a look. So we have this thing called request params. Here's where the variables tab is going to be a bit nicer to look at, because this is a hash map of essentially the data that's available to us. So I extend this hash map, and you see that we only have a couple of items right now. We have submit is 0. That's actually our submit button. And then we have search term equals Paul. So we could pull out the search term by using the key here. I can run back and I can say, okay, request params, and then we can say .get, and then we can say search term. Now, I won't bother to restart the debugger for this, because I'd rather show you a little trick we can do in Eclipse when we have the debugger running. We simply right-click and say inspect, and what it's going to do is it's going to run the line that I've highlighted, and it's going to run it in the current debug session and tell us what it would return if I were to actually execute this. In this case, it's going to return Paul. So you see, we essentially get the same results between these two different methods. The advantage of the lower method is if we don't know all of the name value pairs that are coming across, or they may vary. For example, you might have a complex form where you pick some checkboxes and radio buttons at the top of the form, and that determines what the user will see in the form itself. This is a really good way to go through and just sniff through all of those name value pairs and find the ones that are relevant. But for my preference, I do prefer to be a little bit more explicit when I can. So I'm going to re-enable this endpoint above, and this endpoint down below, I'm just going to say search plants all. So we can keep it there. We can look at it in our source code repository. But nonetheless, from now on, we are going to continue to hit search plants. Now, we've made some big strides here, because you notice we've been able to get from our web form into our controller class. From our controller class, we can jump down into our service layer, just like our specimen service stub. That's a discussion that we can have in a whole other video, because it's not as related to this one, but nonetheless, this video gives us a nice point where we can jump off and have this discussion. So I hope this video has been helpful. I look forward to seeing your comments. Thank you.